Hi, I'm Katie Miranda, and I'm your host of the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit. And today with me here is Charlotte Cates, who is the International Coordinator for the Samidoun Prisoner Solidarity Network. She's also the member of the organizing committee for the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. She's also the coordinator of the National Lawyers Guild International Committee. So Charlotte, you're the founder of Samidoun, right?
Yes, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about Samidoun and how it got started?
Sure. Well, Samidoun is a Palestinian political prisoner support organization, and it focuses specifically on the issue of Palestinian political prisoners. As you may know, there are currently around 6,000 Palestinians jailed in Israeli prisons. Over 450 of them are jailed without charge or trial under administrative detention. And this isn't something that's a new problem. That in fact, from the very beginning of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, even before 1948, when Palestinians were struggling against British and Zionist colonization for their liberation, Palestinian prisoners were leading the struggle and were being locked inside bars, were facing home demolitions, assassinations, and executions for defending Palestinian land and Palestinian people and seeking independence and freedom. Today, because the Palestinian prisoners are such a central part of the Palestinian struggle, because they represent leadership that has been stolen from the Palestinian people, because they represent the voices of those who are community organizers, labor leaders, women's organizers, student movement leaders, freedom fighters, the ones who are on the front lines of resistance are the people who are targeted by Israel for imprisonment. And so because the prisoners are so central to the Palestinian struggle, we wanted to do everything that we can outside Palestine on an international level to popularize the issue of Palestinian prisoners, raise awareness about their struggle, and build, as much as we can, an effective network that brings people together around the world to struggle for their freedom as a collective group and as individual cases of Palestinian prisoners. The actual formation of Samidoun originally was inspired by a mass hunger strike which took place in Israeli prisons in September 2011 against isolation and solitary confinement of Palestinian leaders like Ahed Tamimi. It was, again, Samidoun was inspired to grow in early 2012 with the hunger strikes of Khader Adnan and Hannah Shalabi, who struck for many, many days in a struggle against administrative detention, imprisonment without charge or trial. Since that time, we've grown as a network from our original founding in Canada to involve people around the world. People organize as Samidoun in Palestine and Lebanon, as well as in Greece, Germany, Belgium, the United States, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere.
So the focus of this telesummit is basically what are the successes and what are the failures of the movement for Palestinian rights. Can you tell me what some of the successes and failures are specific to the movement for solidarity with political prisoners?
Absolutely. And I think this is a very important issue that you're bringing up, and it's a very important discussion for all of us to have as a movement in terms of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, because it really goes hand in hand and in parallel with many discussions that are happening in the Palestinian National Liberation Movement itself as well. So it's critical for us to have these conversations. While dealing with issues of Palestinian prisoners can sometimes seem depressing, because every day when you wake up and you open the news, there's another story about 12 people or 20 people or 8 people getting arrested last night when Israeli occupation forces burst into their homes in the middle of the night, dragging people from their beds and disrupting families and terrorizing children. And every morning you wake up and you read these stories. But at the same time, there is a growing international movement to challenge the detention of Palestinians and to fight for Palestinian prisoners. It's one reason why we're seeing such a reaction from the other side and an intensified campaigns of demonizing Palestinian political prisoners. But the failure of those campaigns in many ways, I think, was illustrated most recently by the case of Ahed Tamimi. And of course, Ahed, who many people are very familiar with her story, is a 17-year-old girl from the village of Nabi Saleh, who with her family is very deeply involved in anti-colonial land defense work in her village, fighting against settlements, fighting against Israeli occupation soldiers that are coming to take their land and even their spring of the village for their water source. So the Tamimi family has over the years made a lot of alliances with international movements and groups and organizations to draw attention to the struggle in Nabi Saleh, which is sort of a microcosm of the struggle in many places throughout occupied Palestine against colonization, settlement, and apartheid. And when Ahed, their 17-year-old daughter, was arrested, and Ahed is someone who has been on the front lines of demonstrations in Nabi Saleh for years. She's been seen, going against heavily armed Israeli occupation soldiers as a young girl to try to save her brother, who was being tackled and attacked by these heavily armed soldiers. And on this day, in December of 2017, her cousin had just been shot in the head by Israeli occupation forces and seriously injured when more soldiers were coming to use her family's land and her family's home as kind of a vantage point to repress demonstrators below. And she, went to an Israeli soldier and started demanding that he get off of their land, that he leave, and he wouldn't leave. And this, of course, is a heavily armed soldier and, next to a petite 17-year-old girl, just confronting him with her will and her body and her mind and her spirit. And at the time that this was happening, Ahed's mother, Nariman, was live streaming the whole confrontation on Facebook. And Ahed confronted the soldier verbally, and she also slapped the soldier. And she demanded that the soldier, get off of her family's land. And actually, this video went viral. It was circulated by Palestinians and by supporters of Palestine as a symbol of courageousness, as a symbol of steadfastness, as a symbol of how young Palestinian girls are actually leading on the forefront of confronting occupation soldiers, that the Palestinian cause isn't lost, that there's hope as long as there are Aheds being born. And she also was a symbol to people engaged in movements of struggle around the world, from indigenous strugglers in Canada, demanding an end to pipelines on their land, the same within the United States, to people involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Liberation movement in general. Ahed became a comrade, someone who was facing the same kind of struggle and putting her body on the line in the same way that people do around the world to fight for freedom. And so 2 days later, but of course to the Israeli occupation, this video meant the opposite. It was a national shame that a Palestinian teen could, attack an Israeli soldier. And they would use these terms, they would use these, really sexualized and disgusting language about Ahed, but they would also use these terms about the demonstrations and call them popular terror in Nabi Saleh. And so the term terror was, simply applied to anywhere that Palestinians exist. When the Israeli occupation soldiers invaded the Tamimi's home and arrested Ahed and took her away, and then took her mother later the same day, there was an international outcry about this case. And in many ways, since this is a discussion within the movement, the outcry over Ahed's case has been criticized because it seems like it's unusual or different than that which happens with many other Palestinian child prisoners. And I'm sure there are a number of complex reasons for this that, do range from sort of mainstream media interest in Ahed's appearance to the reality that her family has been organizing for years and building very close alliances with people around the world, and that this live streamed video on Facebook Live that anybody could see was so central to this whole debate and so central to this whole discussion. But so even though there's been this critique, I think that Ahed's case is very important in terms of looking at a success of the movement. Now, is it a success that Ahed and Nariman Tamimi went to jail for 8 months? No, it's not. The sentence is not a success. And in reality, when we're looking at Israeli occupation military courts that convict 99.74% of people that come before them, it's very difficult to look at our victories as those that are obtained, in the court or through law. But the ways that Ahed's case were a victory is that it didn't just draw attention to Ahed's case. It drew attention to the hundreds of Palestinian children who are in Israeli jails now and the hundreds more that are arrested each year and, in fact, each month. It drew attention to the fact that the Palestinian struggle is, very much encapsulated in this video of Ahed. Is a population fighting with their bodies and their lives for their land against a heavily armed force that seeks to deprive them of their dignity and their rights and their lives. And so the fact that Ahed's case made international news is something that helps to break the mythology and the propaganda promoted by the Israeli state, which wants to portray itself as a democracy, which wants to portray itself as, a light of freedom in the world. Well, Ahed's case helped to expose the reality of what Israel is. It's the opposite of a light of freedom to the world. That's what Ahed Tamimi is, and that's what the other hundreds of Palestinian children and thousands of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails are. So that, while we can critique aspects of that international mobilization for Ahed's liberation, we can also see within it a tremendous potential for victory and a tremendous potential where, once again, like decades ago, where Leila Khaled is a symbol for strugglers around the world, Ahed Tamimi, in a very different way and with a different approach, is also not replacing Leila as a symbol, but joining Leila as a symbol of Palestinian struggle that can inspire and lead global movements for justice and change and liberation.
Yeah, one of the points you made was that her video was live streamed by her mother, Nariman, and I'm wondering if that's, that's like a specific tactic that's effective, the fact that it's live on Facebook. I haven't seen that a whole lot, I think because the technology is somewhat new. But do you think the live aspect of, these confrontations is important?
I think that it can definitely be important. I think that the kind of grassroots journalism that we see Palestinians performing, in addition to the work of Palestinian journalists, professional journalists on a daily basis, in terms of putting those videos on social media, whether they're live streamed or even those that are filmed, that are recorded and uploaded later, is critical. And I think this is one reason why we're seeing a couple of trends, disturbing trends that really need international attention and solidarity. One is the mass arrest of Palestinians. Hundreds of Palestinians have gone to jail for posting political opinions on Facebook. Right. This is labeled as incitement. People have spent months and years in prison for posting about politics on Facebook. And this is because, for all of the critiques that we can make of social media and our movements, Israel views social media as a threat. Palestinians, face separation of all kinds. The separation of Palestinians in 48 from those in the West Bank, from those in Gaza, from those in Jerusalem, from those in the refugee camps in Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan, and from the broader Palestinian diaspora. So there's, this constant attempt to isolate groups of Palestinians from one another. And as limited as it is, social media provides a way to kind of transcend those limitations and converse with one another and organize to a certain extent, or at least to converse, at least to fight back against isolation. And so that's why we're seeing hundreds of people being arrested and going to jail for posting on social media. In fact, that was what Nariman was sentenced for in this case. She was sentenced to 8 months in prison for posting this very live stream video. And that's an attempt to crack down on something that is a very powerful force of support and solidarity. In addition, we're also seeing an attack on Palestinian journalists. So in August and July 2018, a number of Palestinian journalists have been arrested. Several Palestinian journalists have been sent to administrative detention, imprisonment without charge or trial. And again, this is an attempt to prevent the reality of what's happening in Palestine from reaching people in the broader Arab world and internationally.
Charlotte, could you talk a little bit about some of the broader successes and broader failures in the movement in general, like not just about Palestinian prisoners?
Sure. Well, I think one of the challenges that we face today as a movement, I mean, there are many challenges that we face because we are confronting, imperialism, capitalism, and Zionism. We're confronting, one of the most well-armed armies in the world, backed up by the best armed army in the world, the U.S. Army. So the enemies that we're facing are complex and also quite powerful. And the fact that they are a huge danger to the well-being of the earth, society, and humanity means that the struggle is very important, even at the same time that it's very difficult. But because we are confronting those who have power, we try to use very frequently the mechanisms of law to struggle for the freedom of Palestinians. We try to appeal to international law, to the International Criminal Court, to international human rights standards. And we can show and we can document clearly the numerous Israeli violations of human rights standards, particularly in the case of Palestinian political prisoners. And of course, in the ongoing killings in Gaza and the attacks on the Great March of Return, not to mention the denial of Palestinian refugees' right to return itself, and the creation of Israel as a settler colonial apartheid state built on the dispossession of Palestinian land and Palestinian people. But while we're trying to rely on law, sometimes I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the mechanism of law that we're engaging in isn't one that's been liberated. It's not one that belongs to the people. It's one that still exists within the very system that gives Israel its legitimacy. It's part of the very system that, even as Israel and the United States blatantly and flagrantly violate international law around the world, they continue to use these mechanisms to justify military invasions and occupations of countries and nations around the world. And at the same time, they are changing the boundaries of law and what law means. And we're seeing this especially through the framework of the so-called war on terror and the creation of anti-terror laws. In the United States, the creation of anti-terror laws wasn't inspired by 9/11, even though the Patriot Act was, is one of the most egregious examples of this legislation and how it's used in a repressive manner against people. It was inspired actually by the Oslo Accords. And so we saw the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which created the first official list of foreign terrorist organizations, go into effect. And part of the justification for this law was to stop organizations that could, that were opposed to the peace process. So this was a way of saying that all Palestinian organizations that wanted to continue to struggle for the liberation of Palestine and were not content with what we now see the disaster that Oslo has become, should be criminalized and should be stopped from engaging in communication, in mutual support, in fundraising with the Palestinian diaspora in the United States and later around the world, because we've seen the same kind of anti-terror laws adopted in Canada, the UK, the European Union, Australia. Again, we're looking at largely the countries that are part of the global imperialist system that are adopting these kinds of anti-terror laws. And so we can see examples of, Palestinian political prisoners in U.S. jails, like the Holy Land Five, serving sentences of up to 65 years for fundraising for Palestinian charities, not even for engaging in political work. But fundamentally, the purpose of these laws isn't so much to put people in jail, even though there have been horrific cases of that, but to change the way in which we think about and advocate for Palestine. If we go back historically and we look at the Palestine Solidarity Movement and how Palestine Solidarity activists interacted with the Palestine Liberation Movement in the 1960s, the 1970s, and even the 1980s, we see recordings being put out of revolutionary songs talking about armed struggle in the refugee camps. We see posters talking about the liberation of all of Palestine. It's not that people just started opposing a two-state solution in the 2000s. This is something that's, the historic demand of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And so historically, the reference point for the Palestinian Solidarity Movement was the Palestine Liberation Organization was the Palestinian resistance movements that were engaging in direct confrontation and struggle against Zionist forces. But when we're looking at today through the framework of two problems, anti-terror laws and the crisis within the Palestinian national movement through the issues of Oslo and the Palestinian Authority, what we see is that the Palestine Solidarity Movement often is confused about what its reference should be. There are important initiatives from Palestine, like the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. These are critically important initiatives that have been endorsed broadly by both civil society organizations and NGOs, but also by the political parties and the factions in Palestine. And so it is, clear that Palestinians are calling on the Solidarity Movement to work to boycott Israel. But at the same time, the whole purpose of these anti-terror laws is to change our focus and to redirect the movement so that people feel like they can't talk about the Palestinian organizations that are engaged in resistance. People feel like it's dangerous, and it's a very legitimate fear that people have because of the repressive actions of the state, that it's dangerous to post statements from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or Hamas or even the DFLP or Fatah on their Facebook pages. People feel like it's a frightening thing to share these statements and discussions and articles within their solidarity groups. And so what that means is that the understanding of Palestinian politics and the understanding of the Palestinian struggle shrinks and becomes smaller, and it becomes focused solely on NGOs, organizations that describe themselves as nonviolent, and all of these organizations are doing very important and wonderful work. But it's also critical that if we're going to support a struggle, if we're going to support a national liberation movement, that we understand the full breadth and depth of that movement and support it, at least morally, in all of its aspects of struggle, in all of its aspects of liberation. And this is something that's being violently stripped away from the Palestine Solidarity Movement by the creation of anti-terror laws, by surveillance, by the repressive actions of the state. And so it's our responsibility to strategize to confront these anti-terror laws, to confront the fact that Palestinians in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere are coming under attack as part of the very same types of legislation that's sending Palestinians to jail inside occupied Palestine. And so we have to develop a strategy to confront the terrorization of communities and the terrorization of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian movement. We have to be able to speak clearly and understand clearly what the stakes are in Palestine, and that it's not just limited to NGOs. Right. And as much as that work is critical, as much as that work is important, that's not the limit of that's not the limit of the cause. We can't make invisible the freedom fighters who every day put their lives on the line to struggle by all means for the liberation of their land. Instead, we have to hold them as dear and as central and essential to the struggle. And so one reason why we focus as Samidoun and many others around the world focus on the struggle to free Palestinian political prisoners is because these are people who are resisting. And because they are resisting, they are targeted by Israel. And we are demanding the freedom of all of these prisoners. We affirm that Palestinians have a right to resist, and they have a right to resist by all means necessary. And this is a challenge in an era of anti-terror laws, in an era of state repression, but it's a challenge that we must strategize and rise to meet, because the consequences are devastating if we do not.
That's actually a really interesting point, because that's sort of come up for me with this telesummit. It's like there are people I would like to interview for it, people in the resistance movements, but it's like, well, I don't know if I'm going to go to jail for that. You know, it's really vague. The language of these laws are really vague, and it's something that you and I talked about previously. So could you tell me a little bit more about what you think activists around the world should do more of, and what should they stop doing? Like, what has proven to not work and we should just not waste our time on anymore?
Well, I think I mean this is a big question. What we should we do more of? Because I think in many ways, when we do work, when we engage with people, when we engage with ordinary people, every time we go out and like give out leaflets outside a supermarket, every time activists go into a Lidl and start labeling Israeli avocados as apartheid produce and start making speeches in the middle of a store, every time that this happens, even if only one or two people is reached, what we're doing is we're speaking to people besides ourselves. And this is so critical. So I don't want anybody to devalue the work that they do in organizing a small demonstration, in going to a supermarket, and doing a flyering, because these are the small activities that keep a movement alive at its grassroots. And so I think that we all need to be doing more interacting with other people. And we all need to be doing more speaking about Palestine in our daily lives, even when we're already doing it all of the time, because we don't just want to speak to other people in the movement. We want to.
We don't want to become an echo chamber.
We don't want to become an echo chamber. And because, the struggle for the liberation of Palestine is bound up with the liberation of others. If we're, in the United States and Canada, we can't do this work without talking about the oppression and genocide against indigenous people, because we're confronting the same kinds of settler colonial systems, even though there are, important differences in many ways. If we're going to fight racism in Palestine, we have to be fighting against deportations. We have to be fighting and standing with the Black liberation movement in struggles against racism. And so that's the other thing that I think we need to do more of, not in a superficial way, but the Palestinian liberation movement has always been internationalist. It's always been rooted in anti-colonial international struggle, stretching from, there's this classic Palestinian poster that shows the banner of victory being handed from a Vietnamese soldier to a Palestinian fighter, taking up the struggle forward against colonialism and for liberation. And so we don't need to sort of professionalize this and make it a meeting where, NGOs from the different movements come together to talk about our issues, but to really bring back that spirit of internationalism and anti-colonial communication and global resistance. And we can do that in all of our communities, not just at kind of the higher national and international level. In terms of what we should do less of, it's really important that we have our debates as a movement. It's really important that we are critical and that we're conscious and that we're looking out. We're looking out for each other and we're looking out for the future of Palestine. But when we are going to engage in debates on social media, it's important that we think about these debates in terms of what are they doing for our movement? What are they doing for people struggling for liberation, rather than the kind of individualism that can come forward, especially under capitalism, especially in a society that's very much pushing the sale of the individual as a brand. It's when we live in a society that's based on these ideals, even when we're very committed to struggling against them, it's very easy for individualism to become the framework and the center of our movement. But we have a collective responsibility that's not just individual. And so when we debate with each other, when we struggle with each other, we have to think about that collective responsibility. And sometimes that can mean that we need to be harshly critical, and we need to raise those critical voices because it's not enough to save ourselves as individuals. And at other times it means thinking about how we engage in struggle together in a way that's principled, in a way that moves toward the liberation of Palestine, and that embraces the full scope of Palestinian demands and Palestinian resistance and never quashes them down, minimizes them, or sort of attempts to negotiate Palestinian rights with Zionists or their apologists.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I've seen a lot of really destructive behavior between individuals and between organizations. And when we see that kind of destruction going on, within our collective group, what it becomes more about individuals and their own egos. And the issue of Palestine is kind of forgotten. And for me, that's definitely one of the things I've seen in this movement that I've been a part of for quite some time. I think that's one of the most destructive forces that I've seen. So we are about out of time now, and I want to thank you very much, Charlotte, for being on the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit, and I will talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thanks, Charlotte.